I'm going to guess that for many of you who have been involved in ministry of some kind in your lifetime, that at some time or another you lost that zeal, that excitement, that strength, that power, your spiritual edge, if you will. I mean, things were going along well, and God was blessing your life and showing His power in His ministry that He had you working in. Now, I'm not talking about just those who were preachers or worship leaders or missionaries or evangelists or Sunday school teachers or small group leaders. You might not have been one of those, or you may have been, but if you weren't, you were still involved in some kind of ministry because you saw God moving in areas. God used you in ways to help encourage others who were down. Maybe He used you as a prayer warrior, that you were praying for people and God was answering those prayers. Maybe it was just when you read His Word, He was showing you great things and you were excited about living for God. You were experiencing that double portion living we've been talking about in this series. Does that sound like any of you? Or maybe someone like you, what you once felt? And things were going great for you. But then somewhere along the way, you lost that joy, that excitement, that power, that spiritual edge. Oh, you didn't mean to lose it. It just happened. Maybe it was the circumstances of life that brought you down. Maybe it was something that happened over time. Maybe you just grew complacent in your walk with God. Or maybe it really was an act of sin that drove a wedge between you and God. But for whatever reason, you no longer had that joy, that excitement, that zeal, that power, that edge. Have you been there before? Maybe some of you are still there right now. Listen, I can relate. If you've been partaking in this series on double portion living, where we've been digging into the life and ministry of Elisha, then you have heard me talk about that great spiritual depression that I was in about a year ago. I had lost my edge spiritually, and I was wallowing in depression and discouragement. And as I've discussed a few times in this series, it's when I started studying the life and ministry of Elisha that God started teaching me things that transformed my life. And the things that I learned from 2 Kings chapter 6 that we're going to be looking at today about the floating axehead help bring back my spiritual edge. So let's look at this rather obscure story from the life and ministry of Elisha. You see, at this time in Elisha's ministry, he was kind of overseeing a school for prophets, not to be confused with a school for profit. This was a school where the young prophets were being trained. It was kind of like a seminary. Anyway, they kind of outgrew the facilities that they were in already, and so one of the prophets came up with this idea that they should expand their campus. And so they went to Elisha and said, hey, can we all go down to the Jordan River and chop down the big trees around there, haul them back up to where our seminary is, and expand it? Elisha thought that was a good idea. So here they were all chopping away at the trees, when suddenly one of the young prophets yelled out that his axe head had flown off and landed in the river. The young man was quite upset here, and he cried to Elisha that this was a borrowed axe and that he had no way of paying for it to return it to the guy. You see, this young man was like so many of us are, the kind that I talked about at the beginning of this message. We were doing so well spiritually, chopping down the trees, working hard for the glory of God. We were sharp at what we were doing, and God was blessing us. But then in the midst of our hard work, we lost that edge, just like the man did in the story where he lost the edge off of his axe. Our axe head went flying into the river, and our zeal for God sunk to the bottom. And now here we are, standing with this young prophet on the edge of the river, wondering if we are ever going to get our axe head back. Will we ever find that joy, that excitement, that zeal, that power, that edge back in our Christianity? And that, I believe, is the crux of this simple story about Elisha causing an axe head to float to the surface. From this story, we can learn certain truths about how to help us get our spiritual edge back when we've lost it. So let's look at some of these truths. Truth number 1, realize you lost your edge and accept responsibility for it. Until we realize what we have lost, we can never get it back. Until we accept responsibility that we indeed lost our edge, we'll never get it back. The man in the story did not blame the manufacturer of the axe. He did not blame anyone else for it. He took responsibility for it, and even though it might have been through no fault of his own that he lost that axe head, he was worried about the fact that he had borrowed that axe head and he could not pay for it. It's easy for us to blame others for the fact that we've lost our zeal. We might blame our parents or even our pastor. Maybe it's our spouse we want to blame, or perhaps it's our job. Maybe we just want to blame circumstances of life. But for whatever reason and for whatever we want to blame, we don't take responsibility for the loss of our zeal. And as long as we don't take the responsibility for that loss, then we will never get our edge back. See, that's where I was about a year ago. Starting right about a year ago at this very time and getting worse over the next 7 months, I lost my edge. And for a time, I blamed others for it. It wasn't my fault that I had lost my edge, that I was sinking into the river of depression. I was doing just fine. In fact, I was doing more than fine, and I had my spiritual edge. But then others disappointed me and hurt me, and I wanted to blame them for the fact that I had lost my spiritual edge. I wanted to blame my church. I wanted to blame my small group for what was happening to me spiritually. I mean, had only they done something differently, then I would have never lost my edge. And I blamed them for months. And as a result, my spiritual edge sunk to the bottom of the river and it stayed there. I mean, it was gone. I thought it was gone forever. I really, really did. I had lost all confidence in that edge, and as a result, I lost all confidence in people. And my edge would have stayed down there at the bottom of the river had God not shown me the things that we're going to talk about in this story today. So first I had to realize that I couldn't blame others for the fact that I lost my edge. I mean, could they have done things differently? Well, yeah, they sure could have. But that wasn't my problem. They weren't the reason I had lost my edge. I had to take responsibility for that myself. But then I also had to realize truth number 2, and that was the truth that escaped me for so long when I had lost my edge. It was never really mine. See, that's what truth number 2 tells us. Realize that the edge you once had was not your own. See, the young prophet went to Elisha and told him that he had lost the axe head that wasn't his. The edge that he had been using to cut down the trees did not belong to him. It was lent to him by somebody else so that he could help build the seminary. And what an important truth that is for us to understand. You see, when things are going well for us spiritually and God is blessing us in immense ways and he is using us in ministry, and we feel like we have that it factor, that edge that gives us joy and excitement for God, we have to understand that those things are there because God has lent them to us. That edge is not ours because of anything we have done. We didn't buy it. We didn't make it. We certainly didn't deserve it. It was lent to us by God. You see, I think that is part of what set my edge down to the bottom of the river about a year ago. You see, I felt like I had that edge. I had done something that really encouraged people in their prayer life. And for a couple of weeks, 3 on the outside, I felt that God was using me in that kind of capacity. I was excited about what God was doing, and I felt like I had that it. I had that edge. But that was the problem. I thought I had that edge. I knew what I needed to do, and I kind of figured I knew what God wanted me to do with that edge. And I was chopping away at those spiritual trees, working hard for God, and loving doing it. And that was a good thing. There wasn't anything wrong with that. What I was doing was good, and I will go to my grave believing that what I was doing was good. But it wasn't as much as what I was doing as how I was doing it. I was doing it trying to rely on my own edge, not the edge that God had lent me. And then one day, my edge went flying off and went straight to the bottom of the river. And it stayed there for about 7 months, until I learned the truths that I've been going over in this life and ministry of Elisha over the last several weeks. And until I was able to see that that edge that I once had was not my edge, but it was God lending me his edge, I was doomed to stay at the bottom of that river forever. So what happened after the young prophet desperately admitted to Elijah that he had lost his borrowed axe head? Well, let's look at Elisha's response. "Where did it fall?" the man of God asked. When he showed him the place, Elisha cut a stick and threw it into the water at that spot. Then the axe head floated to the surface. "Grab it," Elisha said, and the man reached out and grabbed it. Let's look a little bit deeper into that question that Elisha asked the young prophet. Where did it fall? In other words, where did you see it last? Where did you last see that edge that you had? When did you last feel that joy, excitement, and zeal for God? What were you doing when you felt God constantly revealing himself to you? And that's going to bring us to truth number 3. Remember where you last had your edge. Perhaps you were just busy doing the work of God and you started focusing more on the trees that you were cutting down than the God that you were cutting them down for. And slowly over time, you lost that edge. If that's you, then go back to where you were before you lost that edge. Refocus your heart and focus it on God and not so much the works of God. Or maybe you can trace the loss of your edge to when you stopped doing things that helped you spiritually. Maybe you stopped meeting with other believers in a small group, and therefore you lost that constant support and encouragement that we need from other people. Maybe you didn't think that meeting together was really all that important. Maybe you got upset with others who criticized you, whether it be justly or unjustly, and that caused you to lose your edge. Maybe you stopped spending as much time alone with God in prayer and Bible reading. Maybe you started making excuses for missing time with other Christians, or missing times in prayer or Bible reading. Your work, your family, or something else demanded more time from you, and you let the things of God start to slide away. Little by little, you started losing your edge. You missed one day spending time with God, and now another happens later, and before long, you're very irregular in your time with God. The same thing can be said of going to church or being part of a small group. You miss 1 week here, a few weeks later you miss another week, then before long you're missing more than you're actually going. You've lost your edge. For me, I had to look back at that time that I had my edge and determine when and how I lost it. In this case, with very little effort, I could pinpoint the exact date that started my downfall. And no, it wasn't some gross major sin or anything like that that caused my axe head to go flying off and land in the river. It wasn't a sin. It was much more that I kind of started focusing on ministry and myself more than God. Well, then I had to find a way to refocus. And it took me about 7 months to do it. And thanks largely to the study of Elisha and his ministry that eventually translated into these messages on double portion living, I was able to eventually get back my joy and excitement, zeal, that edge that I had for God. But then there was one more thing I had to do to get my edge back. It's the same thing that young prophet had to do. You see, after God caused the axe head to float to the surface, Elisha told the young man to get into the water and go get the axe head. Truth number 4 today. When God shows you how to get your edge back, take hold of it. It can be so easy once we have lost our edge, once we've lost that joy and excitement for God, once we have been hurt in ministry, to never want to get back in the game. And believe me, I've been there before. I told you a few weeks ago about that first crushing blow I had to ministry that sent me into an over decade-long absence from ministry, because not only had I lost my edge, but I didn't really want it back, because I didn't want to experience the pain of losing it again. And during that time, I'm sure God was ready to show me how to get my edge back, but I wasn't listening. And I didn't reach out to take hold of ways that He showed me how to get it back. However, this last time, after having my edge sink to the bottom of the river for 7 months, I really did all along want that edge back. I wanted it back, and when I started following the first 3 truths that we talked about today, God caused my axe head to float back to the surface. And I got all excited again about things that God was showing to me. But my edge would not have come back had I not stepped out and taken hold of it. I started taking some of those things that God was teaching me and developing them in a way that could potentially help others. And so this video ministry began, and many of the truths we have seen in these messages will one day find itself in written form, in the form of a book. I have that edge back, and I'm excited to see what trees God is going to have me chop down next. So now it's your turn. Have you lost that spiritual edge? Is the joy and excitement you once had for God waned? Or perhaps it's even at the bottom of the river? Do you want that edge back? I'm not saying it's going to be easy. When you lose something you love, it's a hard process to get it back. But it's possible. The story of the floating axe head shows us how to get that edge back. I'm living proof that it can be done. But first, you have to embrace the truths that we talked about today. First, realize you lost your edge and take responsibility for that loss. Don't blame it on others. Second, realize that the edge that you once had was not really yours to begin with. It was God's edge that He lent you. Third, remember where you last had your edge. Go back to the time and do the things you did before so that you can rekindle that first love with God. And finally, when your edge is within its grasp, reach out and take hold of it. Don't wait for others to go get it for you, and don't look around and think about how nice it would be to have it in your possession again. Go take hold of it. Follow what God leads you to do and fall in love with Him all over again. If you've lost that spiritual edge, then take comfort because you can get it back. But if you're living right now in the joy of the Lord and you feel like you have that edge, please do what you need to do to keep that edge. And while you're living with that great spiritual edge, keep your eyes open to those around you who might have lost their edge. You might just be that Elisha that they go and talk to because they want their edge back. And you are now armed with the tools to help point them on how to get back their edge. Next time, we are going to be looking at that great story of Elisha and his servant being surrounded by the enemy with seemingly no hope for survival or escape. you won't want to miss the great truths that we are going to be talking about on what happens in the spiritual realm and how it affects what happens in the physical realm. To me, this is one of the most exciting stories in Scripture. So until then, may God surround you with His love, fill you with His grace, and capture your heart.